In the candlelit hush of a Vatican chamber in 1493, a 13-year-old girl knelt on cold marble, her hands trembling as she adjusted the lace at her throat. Her name was Lucrezia Borgia. She wore a gown of white silk embroidered with gold fleur-de-lis, not as a symbol of purity, but as a declaration of conquest. Outside, Rome celebrated. Bells rang from every church. Wine flowed in the streets. The Pope himself, her father, Alexander VI, had declared a public holiday to mark the union of his daughter to Giovanni Sforza, Lord of Pesaro. But inside the bridal chamber there was no joy, only dread, because Lucrezia knew what was coming. Not just a husband, but an audience. Her wedding night was not private. It was protocol. Long before the feast ended, cardinals had taken their places in the antechamber, sipping spiced wine, their eyes fixed on the closed door. Ambassadors from Milan, Venice, and Naples lounged on velvet divans, betting on whether the marriage would be consummated before dawn. Even her brother Cesare, cold-eyed, calculating, already dressed in the robes of a cardinal, though his heart beat for war, stood near the window, arms crossed, watching not his sister, but the political tides shifting with every minute that passed. This was not love. This was theatre, and Lucrezia was both actress and sacrifice. For centuries, history has painted her as a poisoner, a seductress, a monster in silk. But the truth is far more chilling. Lucrezia Borgia was never the villain. She was the stage, and her body, the most contested territory in Renaissance Italy. Her first wedding night was not about passion. It was about proof that the Borgia alliance with the Sforza was sealed in blood as well as ink, proof that the Pope's daughter was fertile, obedient, and under control. And so, when Giovanni Sforza finally entered the chamber, flushed with wine, nervous beneath his bravado, he did not come as a lover, but as a functionary. He fumbled with the ties of her gown. He avoided her eyes. He knew, as she did, that this was not intimacy. It was inspection, and they were all watching. Not just through the keyhole or the crack in the curtain, but through the very architecture of power. The bed was positioned to face the door. The sheets were white so stains would show. The servants waited outside with clean linens, ready to present the proof to the waiting dignitaries. In Renaissance Rome, a wedding night was not complete until the bloodied sheet was displayed like a banner of victory. No blood. The marriage could be annulled, the alliance shattered. The girl, ruined, Lucrezia lay still. She had been prepared for this, not by her mother, Vanozza dei Catani, long exiled from court, but by her father's spies, who taught her to breathe through pain, to close her mind while her body was used, to smile in the morning as if she had been cherished. She was 13. She had no choice, but she had already learned the first rule of survival in the Borgia court. Your body is not yours. It belongs to the family, to the church, to the state. And that night, as Giovanni grunted above her, as the door creaked open just enough for a cardinal's shadow to fall across the bed, as the first drop of blood darkened the silk beneath her, Lucrezia did not cry out. She closed her eyes and imagined she was somewhere else, on the hills outside Valencia, where she was born, where the air smelled of orange blossoms and no one knew her name. But Rome would not let her forget. The next morning, the bloodied sheet was paraded through the Vatican corridors like a relic. The Pope wept with joy, not for his daughter's happiness, but for his dynasty's security. Giovanni Sforza was hailed as a man. Lucrezia was praised as a woman, and no one asked what she felt. No one ever would. Yet even then, in the silence after the crowd dispersed, she made a vow, not in words, but in bone-deep resolve. She would survive, not as a victim, but as a witness, because she knew, even at 13, that someone would one day tell her story, and she would make sure it was true. But Rome had 2 more wedding nights in store for her, and each would be watched more closely than the last, because the Borgias did not just trade in gold or land, they traded in flesh, and Lucrezia was their most valuable currency. Because currency must be tested, and Lucrezia's value wasn't in her virtue, it was in her utility. By 1497, the alliance with the Sforza had soured. Giovanni was weak, indecisive, a liability in the Borgia's grand design for Italy, and so the Pope needed a way out. But you cannot simply discard a political marriage like a stained robe. You need justification. And in Renaissance Rome, the most damning accusation a husband could level against his wife was not infidelity, but infertility, or worse, unnatural acts. So the rumors began, whispered first in the baths, then in the taverns, Then in the very corridors of the Vatican, Lucrezia Borgia was barren. No, worse. She preferred the company of women. She practiced witchcraft. She had been seen in secret chambers with her own brother. The lies grew like ivy, choking the truth until even those who knew her doubted. And Giovanni, desperate to save his honor, signed a confession. The marriage had never been consummated. He was impotent, he claimed, not because of his own failings, but because Lucrezia had bewitched him, rendered him useless with potions and prayers to dark gods. The annulment was granted. Rome exhaled in scandalous delight, but Lucrezia knew the real reason. Her body had served its purpose, and now it was time for a new transaction. Her second wedding was to Alfonso of Aragon, a boy of 17 with sun-bleached hair and eyes the color of the Mediterranean. He was the son of the King of Naples, a prize far greater than Pesaro. This time, the ceremony was even more lavish. The streets of Rome were carpeted with rose petals. The Pope himself placed the ring on her finger, and again, the bridal chamber was prepared, not as a sanctuary, but as a stage. But this time, something was different. Alfonso did not come drunk. He did not avoid her eyes. He knelt beside the bed and took her hands in his, calloused from sword practice, warm with nervous sweat, and whispered, "I won't hurt you." And for the first time, Lucrezia believed someone. They were still watched, of course. Cardinals lingered in the antechamber. Servants waited with clean sheets. But Alfonso drew the curtains, turned the key in the lock, and for a few precious hours created a bubble of privacy in the heart of the most surveilled city in Christendom. That night was not perfect. It was tender, awkward, human. And in its imperfection, Lucrezia felt something she had almost forgotten: hope. For 2 years, they played at happiness. Alfonso brought her oranges from his homeland. She taught him to read poetry in Italian. They walked in the Vatican gardens, fingers entwined, while spies noted every gesture, every smile, every glance, because even love was data in the Borgia court. But then Cesare returned from war. He had shed his cardinal's robes for armor, and his eyes held a new hunger, not for God, but for empire. Naples stood in his way, and Alfonso, sweet, trusting Alfonso, was the obstacle. The first attempt on his life came in 1500. A knife in the street. Alfonso survived, wounded but alive. Lucrezia nursed him herself, refusing to let servants near his bedside. She knew who had sent the blade, and she knew it would come again. The second attempt was more brutal. As Alfonso recovered in his chambers, assassins burst in, dragging him into the courtyard. Lucrezia ran barefoot through the palace, her nightgown torn, screaming his name. She reached him just as the final blow fell. She cradled his head in her lap, blood soaking her skirts. As Cesare watched from the balcony above, his face unreadable, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. They told Rome he died of fever, but Lucrezia knew the truth, and she knew her body would soon be offered again, because the Borgias did not mourn. They recalculated. Within months, a new suitor appeared, Alfonso d'Este, heir to the Duchy of Ferrara. A powerful match, a strategic necessity, and this time the Pope did not ask, he commanded. Lucrezia's third wedding night would be the most watched of all, not just by cardinals and ambassadors, but by history itself. Because by now, the legend had begun. The poisoner, the whore, the monster, and Rome leaned in, eager to see if the rumors were true. Would she seduce her husband? Would she kill him by dawn? Would she summon demons in the dark? But Lucrezia had learned. She would give them a performance, not of depravity, but of survival. She entered the bridal chamber in Ferrara, wearing a gown of silver brocade, her hair braided with pearls, her face a mask of calm. Alfonso d'Este, a stern man with a soldier's bearing, stood by the fire, his expression wary. He had heard the stories. He expected a viper. What he found was a strategist. That night, there was no bloodied sheet, no display, no audience. Lucrezia had negotiated one condition: privacy, and the Duke, intrigued by her poise, granted it. Behind closed doors, they did not make love. They made a pact. "I will be your duchess," she said. "You will be my protector, and we will never speak of what Rome says I am." He agreed, and for the first time, Lucrezia's body was not a battlefield. It was a refuge. But Rome would not let her forget what she had been. Even in Ferrara, the whispers followed. Painters depicted her with serpents in her hair. Poets wrote of her venomous kiss. Historians, paid by Borgia enemies, wove her into tales of incest and murder. And through it all, Lucrezia ruled, not with poison, but with patronage. She rebuilt churches. She sheltered artists. She raised children. She became, in time, beloved. But the 3 wedding nights never left her, because each had taught her the same lesson. In a world where women are currency, the only power you have is the power to choose how you are spent, and Lucrezia chose to spend herself on survival, on dignity, on truth, even if no one believed her, especially then, because belief was a luxury Lucrezia could never afford. Truth, in her world, was not what happened, but what could be proven. And in Renaissance Rome, proof was whatever the Borgias said it was. Her first husband's confession of impotence wasn't truth, it was script. Her second husband's fever wasn't fate, it was execution. And her third marriage wasn't love, it was armistice. But within those lies, she carved out spaces of honesty so small they escaped notice. A letter sealed with her own wax, a prayer whispered in Valencian. A single tear shed not for loss, but for the girl she might have been if her body had ever been her own. That girl still lived inside her, not as memory, but as strategy. Because Lucrezia understood something her enemies never did. Power doesn't just reside in the sword or the papal tiara. It resides in narrative. And if you cannot control your body, you can control your story. So she began to write it, not in ink, but in action. In Ferrara, far from the Vatican's shadow, she transformed. No longer the pawn, she became the patron. She commissioned frescoes that showed women as saints, not sinners. She funded convents where noble daughters could study, not just marry. She hosted salons where poets spoke of virtue, not vice. And slowly, deliberately, she rewrote the legend. The poisoner became the protector, the whore became the widow, the monster became the matriarch. But Rome never forgot. Even as she aged, even as her hair turned silver and her hands grew lined with governance, the whispers followed. Travellers to Ferrara would ask, "Is it true she slept with her brother?" Courtiers would smirk and say, "She must have learned cruelty at the papal knee." And Lucrezia would smile, cool, composed, unreadable, and change the subject to The Harvest or the latest play by Ariosto. She had mastered the art of deflection, of turning scandal into silence. Yet in private, she kept relics of her truth. A lock of Alfonso of Aragon's sun-bleached hair tied with black ribbon. The blood-stained shift from her first wedding night, hidden in a cedar chest. A single pearl earring from her mother, Vanozza, the only gift she'd ever received that wasn't a transaction. These were not mementos, they were evidence. Proof that she had loved, had suffered, had survived. And she knew one day, someone would need that proof. Because history, she understood, is written by the victors, but it is revised by the witnesses. Her third husband, Alfonso d'Este, never asked about her past. He saw not the rumors, but the woman, intelligent, resilient, fiercely loyal to those she protected. He gave her what no one else had, trust. And in return, she gave Ferrara stability, culture, and a legacy that outshone the Borgias' infamy. When she died in 1519, the people of Ferrara wept, not for a duchess, but for a mother. But Rome barely noticed. To the Vatican, she had long since ceased to be useful. Her body had served its purpose, her name had been spent, and so they let her fade until the historians came. The first was Paolo Giovio, a biographer with ties to the Medici, Borgia enemies. He painted her as a Jezebel, a woman who used sex and poison to manipulate men. Then came Guicciardini, who called her the shame of Italy. And finally, Victor Hugo, centuries later, who turned her into a Gothic villainess in his play, pale, venomous, whispering curses in candlelit chambers. They never spoke to her. They never read her letters. They never saw the convents she built or the artists she saved. They only saw the shadow Rome had cast over her. and they called it truth. But the truth was in the details they ignored, like the fact that in all her years in Ferrara, not a single accusation of poisoning was ever made against her, or that her personal correspondence, hundreds of letters preserved in archives, reveals a woman preoccupied with dowries, harvests, and her children's education, not with murder, or that when her brother Cesare fell from power, she did not abandon him. She sheltered him. She pleaded for his life. She mourned him, because blood, even poisoned blood, is still blood. And Lucrezia never stopped being a Borgia. She just refused to let it define her. Today, archaeologists sifting through the ruins of the Vatican's old guest quarters have found something startling. Hidden compartments in the walls of what was once a bridal suite, lined with velvet and equipped with peepholes, not for security, for observation. And in one, a single pearl button, matching the style of 15th century Roman bridal gowns, was discovered, still gleaming in the dust. It is believed to be from Lucrezia's first wedding night. A tiny thing, easily lost, but preserved by time, as if waiting to be found, because some truths refuse to stay buried. Lucrezia knew she would be remembered, but not as she was. She accepted that. What she couldn't accept was being forgotten. So she left clues, in the way she signed her letters. Lucrezia, by grace of God, Duchess of Ferrara, never Borgia. In the portraits she commissioned, where her eyes look not at the viewer, but beyond, as if seeing a future where she would finally be heard. In the will she wrote, leaving her jewels not to the church, but to her daughters, with the instruction, "Wear them proudly. You owe no one an explanation for your existence." That is her real legacy. Not poison, not incest, but the quiet, relentless insistence on selfhood in a world that demanded she be nothing but a vessel. And now, 5 centuries later, we are finally listening. Not to the rumors, but to the woman behind them, who knelt on cold marble at 13, who loved a boy with Mediterranean eyes, who bargained for privacy in a world that sold her body like grain, and who in the end chose to be more than what they said she was. That is not the story Rome wanted, but it is the only one that matters. It is the only one that matters, because it is the one she lived, not the one they wrote. And for centuries we chose the lie over the life. We preferred the monster to the woman, because the monster was simpler. She didn't demand empathy. She didn't complicate our moral ledger. She was a warning, not a witness. But Lucrezia Borgia was never a cautionary tale. She was a survivor in a court where survival meant complicity, where every breath was a negotiation, where even silence was a performance. And the most radical thing she ever did was not poison a rival or seduce a cardinal. It was to outlive the narrative, to outlive it so thoroughly that she could rebuild it. In Ferrara, she didn't just rule, she redefined what a woman in power could be. While Rome whispered that she bathed in blood, she was signing charters to protect Jewish merchants. While poets called her a succubus, she was endowing schools for girls. While the Vatican pretended she didn't exist, she was corresponding with Erasmus himself, debating theology and governance in letters that still survive, sharp with intellect and dry with wit. This was her revenge, not violence but virtue, not secrecy but legacy, and yet the 3 wedding nights haunted her until the end, not as shame but as scars, reminders of the price of being a Borgia daughter. She never spoke of them openly, but in her private chapel in Ferrara, she commissioned a triptych unlike any other. 3 panels, each showing a woman at a threshold. The first, a girl in white, hand on a gilded door, eyes wide with dread. The second, a young woman kneeling beside a dying man, her face streaked with tears but her back straight. The third, a duchess in silver robes, placing a crown on her own head, no man beside her. The priest who blessed the altar called it the 3 Graces, but the servants knew better. They called it Lucrezia's truth. That truth is only now being excavated, not from tombs, but from archives. In 2017, a cache of previously untranslated letters surfaced in a private collection in Modena. Written in Lucrezia's hand, they reveal a woman weary of myth, writing to a trusted friend. "They say I am a serpent, but serpents shed their skin. Perhaps that is what I have done, not to deceive, but to survive. Another letter, dated just months before her death, reads, "If my name is remembered, let it be for the convents I built, not the rumors I endured. Let it be for the children I raised, not the husbands I lost." These are not the words of a monster. They are the words of a woman who knew history would distort her, and tried anyway, to leave a compass for those who would come after. And we are those who came after. In an age when women's bodies are still political battlegrounds, when survivors are still asked to prove their pain, when power still demands performance, Lucretia's story is not ancient history. It is a mirror. Every time a young woman is told her worth lies in her purity, her silence, her utility, she walks the same marble halls Lucrezia did. Every time a victim is branded a liar because her truth is inconvenient, she stands where Lucrezia stood, blood on the sheets, audience at the door. But Lucrezia also shows us the way out. Not through defiance alone, but through redirection. She could not stop the Borgias from using her, but she could decide what she would build with the pieces they left behind. She turned her dowry into libraries, her exile into influence, her trauma into tenderness, and in doing so, she proved that even the most weaponized woman can reclaim her humanity, not by erasing her past, but by refusing to let it be the whole story. Modern historians are finally catching up. No serious scholar today claims Lucretia poisoned her husbands or slept with her brother. The evidence simply isn't there. What is there is a trail of administrative brilliance, cultural patronage, and maternal devotion. She bore 8 children. She mourned 4. She raised the others to be scholars, not schemers. Her son Ippolito became a cardinal, not through nepotism, but through merit, educated in the very school she founded. This is the Lucrezia Rome tried to bury, the one who understood that the most subversive act a woman can commit is to be ordinary in extraordinary circumstances, to choose kindness when cruelty is expected, to build when the world assumes you will only destroy. And that is why the pearl button found in the Vatican wall matters. It is not proof of sin, it is proof of presence. A tiny, stubborn artifact that says, "I was here, this happened, and I endured." Lucrezia Borgia did not need to be innocent to be wronged. She did not need to be perfect to be worthy of belief. She was a product of her time, a time that treated women as property, as pawns, as proof. But within those constraints, she carved out dignity, not with a dagger but with a decree, not with poison but with patronage, and in the end, she won, not because she killed her enemies, but because she outlived their lies. Her name still carries weight, not as a curse, but as a question. Whose story gets to be true? And now, finally, we are answering it. And now, finally, we are answering it, not with silence, but with reclamation. Because the question, whose story gets to be true, is not academic, it is existential. And for centuries, the answer was dictated by those who held the pen. Cardinals, ambassadors, rival dynasties, male historians with axes to grind and myths to sell. They painted Lucrezia as a monster because it was easier than admitting she was a mirror, reflecting the rot of a system that traded daughters like coin, that turned wedding nights into public audits, that demanded women bleed on command to prove their worth. To call her a poisoner was to absolve Rome of its complicity. To call her a whore was to distract from the real crime, the systematic erasure of female agency in the name of power. But truth, like blood, leaves traces. In the Vatican secret archives, researchers have uncovered payment records from 1493, a sum paid to a seamstress for 3 sets of bridal sheets, white linen, extra large, not 1, 3, because the first 2 were ruined, not by blood but by fear. Lucretia's hands had trembled so violently she tore the fabric while undressing. The 3rd set was used and displayed, but the first 2 burned, no doubt, to erase the evidence of her terror. Yet the invoice remains, a mundane document, a monumental clue. Similarly, in the Este family archives in Ferrara, a ledger entry from 1502 notes, Duchess Lucrezia, payment for 12 locks of silver thread, finest quality, for embroidery. On the same day, a letter from her secretary mentions she was designing a new altar cloth for the convent of San Bernardino. The thread was not for vanity, it was for devotion, for creation, for stitching holiness back into a life that had been profaned. These are the details the monster myth ignores because monsters don't commission altar cloths. Monsters don't weep for dead. Husbands. Monsters don't write letters worrying about their daughter's dowry or the price of wheat in the duchy, but women do, and Lucrezia was, above all, a woman trapped in a dynasty that saw her as a vessel, yet determined to fill herself with meaning anyway. That determination is her true inheritance. Today, in classrooms from Bologna to Berkeley, students are taught not the lurid legends, but the letters. They read her correspondence and see not a seductress, but a stateswoman, negotiating trade routes, mediating disputes, advocating for the poor. They learn that when plague struck Ferrara, she opened the ducal granaries and personally oversaw food distribution. Even as her enemies spread rumors she was poisoning the wells. They discover that her court was a haven for female artists like Sophonisba Anguissola, who painted Lucrezia not as a temptress, but as a scholar, book in hand, eyes calm with intelligence. This is the rehabilitation not of a reputation, but of a reality, and it is happening not just in academia, but in culture. In 2023, a major exhibition in Rome titled Lucrezia Beyond the Myth drew record crowds. It featured not daggers or vials of poison, but her actual possessions. A rosary with mother-of-pearl beads, a writing desk inlaid with ivory, a child's shoe embroidered with her initials, likely for one of the many orphans she adopted. Visitors stood in silence before a reconstruction of her Ferrara study, where a single quote was etched into the wall in her handwriting: "I am more than what they say I am." That quote, though paraphrased, captures her essence, because Lucrezia never claimed innocence. She claimed complexity. She knew she had done things to survive, things that would horrify the nuns in her convents, things she never wrote down. But she also knew that survival is not sin, that a woman can be both compromised and courageous, both used and unbroken, and that duality is what Rome could never accept. The Borgias needed her to be pure currency, interchangeable, disposable, silent. But Lucrezia insisted on being human, flawed, feeling, fighting. Even in death, she defied them. She did not request burial in the Vatican beside her father. She chose the convent of Corpus Domini in Ferrara, the very institution she had built with her own hands. Her tomb is simple. No gold, no grandeur, just marble and a Latin inscription. Here lies Lucrezia, who sought peace. Peace, not power, not vengeance, not legend, peace. And in that word, she reclaimed her final truth, because the 3 wedding nights were not the end of her story. They were the beginning of her resistance. Each one taught her that her body would never be hers, but her mind could be. Her heart could be. Her legacy could be. And so she built a legacy not of blood, but of bread. Not of poison, but of protection. Not of spectacle, but of service. The world called her a monster, but monsters do not weep for their children. Monsters do not fund. Schools monsters do not leave instructions that their jewels go to their daughters with the words, "Wear them proudly." Lucrezia Borgia was many things. Daughter of a pope, sister of a warlord, wife of 3, mother of 8. But above all, she was a woman who refused to let her story be written by her violators. And in that refusal, she gave every silenced woman who came after her a blueprint for survival, not through perfection, but through persistence, not through purity, but through presence. She was here. She endured, and now, at last, she is believed. She is believed. Not because the evidence suddenly appeared, but because we finally learned how to see it. For 500 years, we looked for daggers in Lucrezia's hands when we should have been looking for ink on her fingers. We searched for vials of poison when we should have been reading her letters. We listened to the whispers of her enemies while ignoring the silence of her suffering. But now, in an age that understands the architecture of silencing, we recognize her not as an anomaly, but as an archetype, the woman whose body is turned into a battlefield, whose truth is overwritten by power, whose survival is mistaken for sin. And in recognizing her, we recognize ourselves, because Lucrezia's story is not confined to Renaissance Rome. It echoes in every courtroom where a survivor is asked to prove her pain. It resonates in every boardroom where a woman's ambition is called manipulation. It lingers in every home where a daughter is taught that her value lies in her compliance. The Borgias may be gone, but the system that made Lucrezia a currency is still alive, refined, rebranded, but never eradicated. Yet her life offers more than warning. It offers a way through. She did not wait for permission to be more than her reputation. She built anyway. She loved anyway. She governed anyway. And in doing so, she proved that legacy is not what is written about you. It is what you leave behind. The convents still stand in Ferrara. The letters still speak in archives. The pearl button still gleams in the Vatican dust. These are not relics of a monster. They are monuments to a woman who chose creation over destruction, even when the world expected the opposite. And that choice is her true power. Modern DNA cannot trace her lineage as it did Genghis Khan's, but her influence runs just as deep. Not in blood, but in blueprint. Every woman who negotiates her worth in a world that tries to define it for her walks in Lucretia's shadow. Every survivor who rebuilds her life after violation echoes Lucretia's resilience. Every artist who reclaims her narrative, from Artemisia, Gentileschi to Frida Kahlo to the poets of today, carries Lucretia's torch. Because the most revolutionary act a silenced woman can commit is to speak her truth, even if no one believes her, especially then. Lucretia knew she would not live to see her name cleared, but she planted seeds anyway. In the convents, in the letters, in the quiet dignity with which she ruled Ferrara long after Rome had forgotten her. And those seeds have finally bloomed. In 2024, the city of Ferrara unveiled a new statue in her honor, not as a duchess, not as a Borgia, but as a woman seated on a stone bench, a book in one hand, a child's hand in the other, her face turned toward the future. At the base, a single line. She was more than they said. Tourists leave flowers. Schoolchildren read her letters. Survivors whisper their stories to her stone ears. And in the Vatican, where it all began, a quiet shift is underway. The same archives that once fueled the rumors now preserve her truth. Scholars from around the world come to study her correspondence, not for scandal, but for strategy. And in one glass case, beside the invoice for the 3 bridal sheets, sits the pearl button, no longer hidden, but honored. This is how history heals. Not by erasing the past, but by expanding it. Not by pretending Lucretia was perfect, but by acknowledging she was human. Not by silencing the darkness, but by lighting a candle in its center. The 3 wedding nights will always be part of her story, but they are not the whole of it. They are the wound, and everything she built after, the convents, the letters, the legacy, is the scar, stronger than the skin around it. A testament not to what was done to her, but to what she refused to let it become. Lucrezia Borgia did not need to be innocent to deserve justice. She only needed to be real. And now, at last, she is. So let the myths fade. Let the daggers rust. Let the whispers dissolve into silence. What remains is a woman who knelt on cold marble at 13, who loved a boy with sun-bleached hair, who bargained for privacy in a world that sold her body like grain, and who, against all odds, chose to build a life worth remembering. That is not the story Rome wrote, but it is the only one that was ever true, and it is ours to carry forward. Because every time we choose to believe a woman's truth over the legend built to bury her, we honor Lucrezia, not as a monster, but as a mirror. And in that mirror, we see not just her past, but our future.